welcome to the Lifestyle Show. My name is Dr. Ian, and I'm very, very pleased and privileged to be joined today by Pastor Bianca and by Genevie. Thank you for joining both. Today's topic for you is the topic of emotional trauma and how it can shape your character. Emotional trauma is a big, big, big issue in the body of Christ, and it's one of the things that we're going to be unpacking for years to come. I want to get us going by sharing a bit of my own life story. My life story began with quite a traumatic, potentially, and quite a dramatic situation. So when I was born, as the story turns out, I wasn't breathing. I was actually a stillborn child. My mum was in the hospital, and as she recounts the story, after I was born, I hadn't breathed for 15 minutes. The doctors had been trying to resuscitate me, they'd been trying to bring me back to life, but I was lifeless. And as she tells the story, she called out to the Lord. She said to God, "Please, give me my baby, I love him." Just after the doctor had told her that he wasn't going to try anymore. My mum says at that point, somehow, some way, I began to breathe. And here I am before you today. And what makes the story so interesting is that they say that if you don't breathe for, say, 3 minutes, you're brain damaged for life. And God has a way of making things work. Not only do I not have brain damage, by God's grace, but I've gone on to become a doctor of education. And God has used my brain in the world to help propel me on my life and to be a blessing for others. And so that's how my life started. And it started in that dramatic way, and on it went. So the background to the story is that my mum was on her own at that time. She'd met her man, who was the first man to ever say that he loved her. And she went into a relationship with him, but when he found out that she was pregnant, he got up and he left. That was my dad, and up until this very day, I've never met the man. Never seen him. And so my mum was on her own. There was a falling out with the family. There was all sorts of trauma going on, and there was my mum as a single young mum with a stillborn baby, but who cried out to God and who God had mercy on, and here I am. And so living with my mum met somebody else. By the time I was about 3 or 4 years old, she married, and we lived in the house in the area where I grew up. But that man then died when I was 6 years old. And so my mum was a widow. I was 6, and that was a really difficult time. I was far too young to really understand what was taking place and what was going on. But what I could see was that my mum was really, really impacted by what had happened. And there was a particular day when I was talking with my mum on the stairs in the house, and she began to speak about the death of her husband. And as she was speaking, she made a comment about blaming herself for what had happened. And when she made that comment, she started to cry. She didn't want me to see her cry, and so she went and she locked herself in the bathroom before I could really see the flood of tears. But it was too late. I'd already seen her crying. And as a 6-year-old, I didn't really know what to do. I was at a bit of a loss. I wanted to say something, I wanted to do something, but I didn't really know what to say. So she went into the bathroom, and I really just wanted to see her happy and see her come out. I had nothing that I could do, nothing that I could say. All I could do was make a commitment to try and do my very best for her, and make a commitment to not bring trouble her way, to try and make her life as pleasant as possible. And so we carried on. She worked 2 jobs to keep enough money coming in. She tried to study at the same time, trying to progress herself. And on we went. We came to my teenage years, however. Things took a bad turn for myself. I became involved in all sorts of things that I'd once upon a time said I would never do. Became quite a troublesome teenager in certain respects. Always tried to avoid bringing it back to the house, and always tried to avoid bringing trouble to my mum's doorstep because that was my commitment. But I was struggling in certain respects with how to be the right way for me to be. Fast forward a few years later, then as a teenager, my granddad passed away. When my granddad passed away, that was probably quite a big moment for me, bigger than I realized at the time, because he was in essence my father figure. He was the one that I had that I could look to as a father figure. And when he passed away, it really, really did hit me. And I remember when he had died, when he had gone, and I'd gone over to the family house to sit with my grandmother, to sit with the family, to be there with them, and to see how we deal with this event. Everything I looked at in that house reminded me of him. Seeing his hat, seeing his scarf, seeing the chair where he sat, seeing his newspaper, remembering the things that he would normally be doing at this time of day. Everything in that house reminded me of him. As I sat there with the family, I felt myself wanting to cry. And just as I felt those tears starting to bubble up inside me, my grandma spoke some words and she said, "Ian, you're not crying, are you? One of us needs to be strong." And so for my grandma's sake, for my family's sake, I decided to be the strong one. And I didn't cry. And I let myself be that rock for the family. But truth be told, although I didn't cry outwardly, I did cry inwardly. I was cutting myself up on my inside with my tears. And that went on for some time. Fast forward to the future, a couple of years later, and God was starting to move in my life. I remember that I was learning about God, and I was looking for a place of worship. And I prayed to God a lot. I didn't just want to end up at any place, right? I was praying to God a lot about guiding me to the right place of worship. And when I went to this particular place of worship, I'd said, "God, if I'm in the right place, give me a sign." And lo and behold, when the speaker at the end of the service that I was in said, "Who wants to give their life to Jesus?" I was the first one up at the front. And I didn't care what anybody else was doing. I knew what was happening in my life at that time. When I opened my eyes and looked around, there were 7 of us. And the ministers there said, "You know, this is a wonderful decision you've made. We're going to take you through to the back and somebody's going to pray for you." So the seven of us went through to the back, and the minister there began to pray for us. Now this was quite interesting. We were standing in a circle, the minister was going around praying, and it just so happened that she started on my left-hand side, so I was going to be the last one in the circle. There were 7 of us in that room, 5 women, 2 guys. I was the second guy. There was another young man in there. When she went to him and she prayed over him, this guy began to cry. I could not believe it. I said, "How can you come to the church and cry? This is terrible. This is a terrible thing that I'm seeing in front of me." Okay, remember that I'm carrying a burden on myself to be the one who doesn't cry. I said, I could never come to a place like this and just cry. But lo and behold, she goes around, she's praying over these people and they're crying, and I don't know why they're crying. Anyhow, she comes over to me and she says, "Why don't you bow your head? Let's see what the Lord will say." And so I bowed my head. And when she began to speak, it was my first real encounter with prophecy. She began to talk about the journey that I'd been on, not knowing my father. She talked about the journey that I'd just been going through in terms of trying to seek and to find God. And then she talked about my future, how I'd become a speaker, how I'd become somebody who brings, God into what I do. And as she was speaking to me, reminding me of things that I'd even forgotten about myself, I knew that my father was speaking to me, and she said, "You've never had anyone to call daddy, but God is your father." And I felt tears welling up on my inside. Now, just 60 seconds ago, I'd committed to never crying in this place. But at that moment, I realized that I'd been crying on my inside for years. And I made a decision to let myself cry at that moment and to let God touch my heart. And that was part of my journey in coming to Christ. I cried solidly for about 2.5 years after that, as I let God heal me from all of the things that I did, all of the things that I'd been through. And I started to transform emotionally under God's presence. And so the early stages of my life were characterized by a particular kind of emotional trauma. But coming to Christ began to undo that and began to give me a sense of transformation. Ladies, can we talk about emotional trauma and God?
Definitely. You know, I find so ironic about what you said in a sense, and I think it's so significant to touch upon, is that actually a lot of the time emotional trauma is so misunderstood because it's called emotional trauma, but just as with you, Dr. Ian, what struck out to me immediately was that your emotional trauma really manifested in a lack of emotion. And so how do you identify and support someone whose actual trauma is really the lack of it? What would you say to people like that their lack of emotions is really evidence of the trauma? Because oftentimes we can look for the anger and we can look for the tears, and we can look at somebody very emotional and go, oh, you know, they're going through a lot and they must be really broken, they're crying all the time. But really, it was the fact that you are holding that in and almost shut yourself up to emotion. That was the evidence of the deep trauma that you experienced.
That is such a deep point, Pastor Bianca, and I'm going to come to you in a moment, Genevie. Really want to hear your thoughts on this, but absolutely I'll respond to that. In my journey then, I found that everybody has emotions somewhere. Now, it just might be hidden, it might be behind something, it might be held in, but everybody's heart is somewhere. Jesus said, is where your treasure is, that's where the heart is. And for some people, they feel that, you know, their treasure is something that's out of reach. Their treasure is something they're never going to obtain. Their treasure is lost in their history somewhere. And so their emotions, their heart is back in the past, or their heart is somewhere where they just can't reach it. So why be emotional? I've not got the thing that I want to be emotional for. And so it takes God to come into the heart and to work a transforming work, to steer the heart back towards future, back towards a purpose, back towards somewhere where it can belong, so that they can become alive again. Genevieve.
I guess for me, some of the things that really stood out as you were speaking was that you experienced a series of losses, and to lose someone or to not even know who your father is, that's really difficult. And I guess it probably weighed on your heart throughout your life. And for me, I would like to know a bit more about some of the thoughts that held you back from really expressing yourself, because I know that maybe a lot of men can relate to you when it comes to expressing emotions. So what were some of the thoughts that were behind you not wanting to show those emotions? Or when your grandma said or made that comment, what were some of the thoughts or your interpretations from that?
Yeah, absolutely. I can give an answer to that. So when the story I told you about my mum crying, the impact that it had on me as a 6-year-old who didn't know what to do is that it made me into a bit of a protector. What I wanted to do was to protect her. I wanted to support her. I wanted to make sure that she was okay. Therefore, my emotions were driven into making sure that she was fine. And to make her feel fine, I have to be fine. So even if I don't feel fine, I'm going to be fine so that she can feel strong. My grandmother saying that comment, and it just reinforced the same thing. So actually all my energy was turned into protection energy. So my emotions were expressed through the actions that I would do to protect and preserve my family. So if my mum would go to Bible study, like she did sometimes, or prayer meeting, and she'd come back late, I'd be out on the street as a 9-year-old with a cricket bat looking for anybody that's messing with her, right? And so I'd go up and down the little the streets that she walked to get to and from church, just to check that nobody was attacking her. So rather than sit at home and have anxiety, I'll just take the cricket bat and leave the house and walk up and down on the street looking for anybody that might be causing an issue. So it was all converted into something else.
I love what you talked about in how you took control over those emotions that you were feeling. And I think this is probably something that's more of an issue for men than it is for women. Women are very emotional beings and men are very logical beings. And so women tend to feel things and men tend to process things mentally. And whilst those both have strengths and weaknesses, which is why men and women really edify each other, because we bring that to the table, what I really hear from you in deciding to go into that role of defender, you took yourself out of a role of son, and you really, even though you'd never seen a father modeled, you really put yourself into a father role as a child, and then of course reiterated by the comment made by your grandmother, and you really went into mind over matter mode. You decided that your feelings didn't matter, and you took control. And now, while we as believers know that we are not dictated to by our feelings matter, and I think that in moments like that, it's so important to make sure that. Even I know my life when I've navigated trauma and I've numbed myself to, I've decided this hurts too much to process, so I'm not going to process it. And we can all come back to a place of saying, Lord, renew, give me a heart of flesh and take away my heart of stone. And sometimes that's a scary thing, but I wonder if you would just share some light to your experiences as really finding a balance to that mind over matter and doing what's necessary to guard and protect your family, but still remaining a heart of flesh at the same time.
Yeah, I think you've read my story quite well, Pastor Bianca. Certainly, I went into that mode. There was a time, so just me having my mum, and there was a very odd conversation that we had once where she says, look, if anything happens to me, you'll be an orphan, which was true. I took it on myself in my head as a 8 or 9 year old, whatever I was at the time, that if something happens to her, I have to pay the mortgage. Wow. Now, in retrospect, I'm not sure how I was going to pay the mortgage, but I'd already made up my mind that that's what I was going to do. And so I was very much, as you said, in that mind over matter. This will happen because it has to happen. Yeah. So it doesn't matter how it's going to happen, it will happen. But I think coming into Christ and having that relationship with the Father gave me an opportunity to explore myself from a safer space. It wasn't all dependent on me. I had a God I could depend on. Yeah. And that's put me into a different position. It's allowed me to reconnect with different parts of myself, to explore different parts of myself. And as you said, to become a son, where before I was acting in a father role already at a very young age. So I think you've read that really, really well.
Yeah. And something that really stood out to me as you were speaking was that you took on a lot of responsibility from a very young age. And I guess with that, it probably didn't allow you to be vulnerable. And I would like to know a bit more about, the transformation. What were the new thoughts that you developed when you came into Christ that allowed you to be vulnerable?
Absolutely. Again, these are brilliant questions. So I think I went on a bit of a journey, and certainly as a teenager, me starting to recognize where some of these things had happened to me, where some of these issues had come into being. I started to also recognize similar issues among my friends. And where I had some good friends and close friends, we started to broach some of these topics. And I actually discovered that a lot of what I feel, I wasn't alone in. That what I was feeling was actually a very common set of emotions for people who've been through certain circumstances. And so it was that journey of starting to, if you like, put myself out a little bit more and finding that there were so many people going through the same things really began to liberate me. And what I've learned over time is, as I was saying to you earlier, Pastor Bianca, about everybody having their emotions somewhere, what I found is that what we go through, other people go through too. And there's, the Bible talks about the things that are common to man. And there are things that are common to man, the things that are common to me, things that are common to you. And our stories are put there for other people too. Our story is someone else's story in a certain sense. People can recognize things that we've been through. They can recognize our journey. We recognize different parts of ourselves in others. And I think that's what the lifestyle show, I think that's what ministry, I think that this is what this is about, is sharing a part of ourselves so that others can see themselves and know that their story can get better, that their story can improve and that they can be transformed.
I have another question for you, Dr. Michael. Sorry, keep calling Dr. Michael. Dr. Ian, I have another question for you, Dr. Ian. It's often a truth that we understand that the same measure that we give ourselves is the same measure that we're able to extend. And so the same measure of grace that we receive, the same measure of love that we receive is the same measure that we're able to extend to others. And you really restricted the measure of grace on yourself as a child to be able to feel and to be able to navigate your emotions, to be able to grieve, to process things that were natural to process, to be compassionate to yourself, to be gracious to yourself. And so I'm just wondering if you noticed through your other relationships, did you notice a trend that as you didn't give yourself grace to feel and you weren't compassionate with yourself, did you notice that you were perhaps the same to others?
Again, I think with me, it was externalized. So I was channeling that out, as I said, towards the family, channeling that out towards others. That took me into a place where I began to do community work. I was running family programs, youth programs, all sorts of things, and I channeled that into the community. So rather than sort of spending it on myself, I spent it on others. But the beauty of that is that people did, of course, reflect that back to me, and so I built some great relationships over time. So advice is to find a good place to put your love. Thank you so much for joining us on the Lifestyle Show. We hope that you've enjoyed yourselves. Thank you, Pastor Bianca. Thank you, Genevie, for joining me. We look forward to